it's time to look at the fightiest Terminators about. Grab your Thunder Hammers and don your Lightning Claws, because we're taking a look at the Terminator Assault Squad. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we've been going through the datasheets from the new Space Marine Codex, seeing how we can get the most out of our units on the tabletop. Terminator Assault Squads are an absolutely iconic Space Marine unit. They're designed to just drop down or pile out of a land raider and obliterate whatever unfortunate Xenos or heretic gets in their way. In this video we'll take a look at the rules for the squad, some of the more obvious combos and synergies that we can use to make them that bit more hitty or that bit more reliable, and how I'd personally field them on the battlefield in their current incarnation. In the background, the Terminator Assault Squad is fielded from veterans of the First Company, and they're deployed in this format when the fighting is likely to be close quarters and brutal. There aren't many enemies that can withstand a barrage of Thunderhammer and Lightning Claws attacks in the cramped confines of a shipboarding action, and the Terminator Assault Squads can wade into the thick of the fighting, protected by nigh impregnable armour. So let's take a look at how these guys will function on the tabletop. So the Terminator Assault Squad is an elite's choice for Codex Space Marines, and in its cheapest version, when it's fielded entirely with Lightning Claws, it will set you back 165 points. They have the standard Terminator stat line, no different from the tactical Terminators with the Power Fist and Stormbolter. They have Movement 5, Weapon Skill and Ballistic Skill 3 up, Strength and Toughness 4, 2 wounds, 2 attacks, Leadership 8 and a 2 up save. And as always, the Sergeant has an extra pip of leadership and an extra attack. As Terminators, they all have a 5+ invul save from their Crux Terminatus as well, and you can include up to 10 models in the squad. Any model can swap out its pair of Lightning Claws for a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, and if you do, then the total model will cost 41 points, so a base squad will cost you 205 points if you want 5 Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminators. In addition, the Sergeant can also take a Teleport Homer, which you basically should, as it's free. So the Lightning Claws have a AP -2, damage 1, and each Terminator will get 1 additional attack. So typically your standard Terminator with a Lightning Claw will be hitting with 4 attacks in the first round of combat when you take into account Shock Assault, and as they're Lightning Claws, they can all reroll the roll to wound. This profile means that they're going to be strongest against fairly heavily armoured 1 wound infantry. They will absolutely blend things like tactical Space Marines, with their good AP helping chew through the power armour, their reroll to wound helping out against decent toughness, and 1 damage means that you're not wasting extra damage against 1 wound infantry. A 5-man squad of these guys on the charge will typically kill 7 tactical Marines if they all get to swing, with their 20 Lightning Claw attacks, which is pretty brutally efficient to be honest. That's with no other buffs or benefits at all. They do of course fall down a bit against vehicles and the like, though they're still not bad per se. Against toughness 7 vehicles they'll do about 5 wounds for a minimum squad, and against a toughness 8 vehicle they'll do about 2 or 3. So they are fairly decent at clearing infantry, but I personally prefer the Thunderhammer and Storm Shields on these guys. The main reason being that Space Marines have an absolutely brutal amount of anti-infantry firepower, with all the crazy amount of bolter shots that they can throw around. So having to get an elite unit into an exposed position and also hope that they make the charge out of deep strike is quite a lot of hoops to jump through compared with just shooting your opponent with a whole bunch of bolters. For me as well, if you're wanting to clear infantry with Terminators, I'd honestly much rather just take the version with the Power Fist and Stormbolter, because they'll be able to clear a whole bunch of infantry just with that Stormbolter alone, which isn't reliant on making the charge, and then they'll get their Power Fist attacks to do even more damage when they do make close combat. So those two things combined are why I generally prefer the Thunderhammer Storm Shield Assault Terminators. So let's look at the damage output of the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminators now. For your 205 points, you'll be getting 16 attacks on the charge with Shock Assault. These guys will only be hitting on 4s, and with less attacks they're going to be not quite as good against hordes and the like. They're not massively worse than the Lightning Claws against tactical Marines though. They'll kill 5.5 on average with a minimum squad charging, though of course they do cost a fair bit more. Against a toughness 7 vehicle, they'll do an average of 13 wounds, and an average of 10 wounds against a toughness 8 vehicle. so not awful against infantry. They're not particularly efficient, but they really put the hurt on heavy targets. With flat damage 3 weapons, they'll also be particularly good against any 3 wound infantry, things like aggressors, or perhaps Borgren, as they'll kill these guys very efficiently. As well as the increased damage output, the fact that these guys carry storm shields is a massive bonus. Terminators with their 2-up saves are most vulnerable to high AP weapons that will force them down to saving on a 5-up on their Crux Terminatus. Having a 3-up save means that there aren't all that many weapons that are going to chew through a squad of Terminators with storm shields easily. Your opponent's either going to have to absolutely drown them in AP1 shooting, or fire a lot of more heavy shots at them and hope that you don't roll a 3-up. I certainly know from personal experience, if you get lucky, you can make a whole load of 3-up saves in a row and completely frustrate a shooting phase if the dice go your way. So I'd say that the Terminators with the Storm Shields and Thunderhammer are probably more durable point for point than the Lightning Claws, even though for the same points you will get an extra Terminator with Lightning Claws, and therefore more wounds. I think I'd rather have a 10 wound unit with Storm Shields than a 12 wound unit without, for roughly the same cost. Like most Space Marine units, these guys have a bunch of special rules. Firstly, Angels of Death will give them access to combat doctrines, so an extra pip of AP in the Assault Doctrine, and of course the ever-present Shock Assault, which will make them hit with much more of a bang than they did in the previous edition of the Codex. They can combat squad into 2 units of 5 models from a squad of 10. As all Terminators, they can teleport strike, so setting them up off the battlefield to come down turn 2 or turn 3, 9 inches away from the enemy, and then hopefully use some sort of buffs to make that charge. Finally, the squad has a free teleport homer, which it does make sense to include. Basically, when you set up the squad, you set up the teleport homer somewhere in your deployment zone, and instead of moving in the movement phase, your Terminator squad can teleport back to the teleport homer, setting up within 6 inches of it, so it has the potential for them to get back into your deployment zone if they'd be more useful there later in the game. The teleport homer is destroyed if any enemy units come within 9 inches of it, so you'd have to set it up fairly conservatively. I honestly can't see it coming up all that often. They're probably just going to want to drop down and get into the thick of the enemy army, but having one extra random movement option isn't a bad idea, even if you don't make use of it very often. So overall, the Terminator Assault Squad is a dedicated melee-only elite infantry unit that usually is going to want to start in reserve, drop down next to the enemy, make a charge, and try and break something important with that fancy close combat gear. So let's take a look at the ways that we can get more out of them on the battlefield. Firstly, we'll talk about chapter traits, and the Assault Doctrine armies are going to stand out more than most when we're looking at this unit. We'll start with White Scars. Their combat doctrine of +1 damage when they're in their unique doctrine is amazing. It's a 33% buff to those already great Thunderhammers, and having damage 2 Lightning Claws might actually make them semi-viable. By being strength 4, re-rolling wounds and damage 2, they'll actually be a very credible threat to most units in the game. If I was ever going to use Lightning Claw Assault Terminators, then it would be in White Scars Assault Doctrine that I would do so. White Scars also have a very useful stratagem for getting a 3d6 inch and pick the 2 highest charge, which can really help make that reliable 9-inch charge. And they also have the Plume of the Plains Runner, a relic that can get them a +1 to charge, which is also very helpful indeed. Moving on, Black Templars are uniquely suited to getting deep striking units into combat, as having an innate reroll charge ability means that you have a very decent chance of making that charge into close combat, even without other buffs. Unfortunately, their doctrine doesn't really synergize very well with the Terminator's weapons. It's best with units that struggle to wound their targets a bit, as automatically wounding when you would have wounded on a 2-up anyway isn't anywhere near as good as automatically wounding when you would have wounded on a 5-up anyway. However, they are an army that's going to want to hang out in the Assault Doctrine where possible, and that extra AP -1 will certainly help out both versions of Terminators. They have a number of different stratagems for helping out melee units, which I won't go into everything here, but as I've said multiple times in the past, their Tenacious Assault stratagem to stop an enemy unit from falling back once they're in combat is absolutely great on these guys. The enemy really isn't going to want to stay in close assault with Assault Terminators, so by using that 2 command point stratagem, you're basically forcing your opponents to make an absolutely terrible move. You could drop down, kill a unit, pile into another unit, and then stop that unit from falling back, so you can go to town on them with your Thunderhammers in the opponent's turn. Blood Angels are a very topical army as they're getting their new Psychic Awakening book in the very near future. I'm afraid at the moment I don't have the full rules for that, although no doubt it will have been fully revealed by the time this video comes out. At the moment, all I can say is that +1 to wound on the charge is amazing on Terminators. The Thunderhammers will be wounding anything that isn't toughness 8 on a 2, and anything that is toughness 8 on a 3. That's really going to break pretty much whatever they want it to. And Blood Angels have all manner of good melee supporting characters available to them, who each provide their own very powerful buffs to an already strong assault unit. Assault Terminators with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields could certainly make an interesting alternative to Death Company or Sanguinary Guard, because they'll be a whole lot harder to shift for the enemy due to that thick armour and 3-up invul saves. Plus the Blood Angels' unique doctrine will be most powerful on units that are big in numbers of models and small in numbers of attacks, so this is pretty much tailor-made for the Thunderhammer Terminators, who, while in the doctrine, will be hitting with 4 Thunderhammer attacks each on the charge, all of those at +1 to wound. You remember how a minimum squad of Thunderhammer Storm Shield Terminators did 10 wounds to a toughness 8 vehicle? Well, if they're Blood Angels with +1 to wound, and in their assault doctrine for an extra attack and extra point of AP, then they'll get a mad 21 wounds on average against that toughness 8 target. So that's very likely to be goodbye Mr. Knight, if you've already put any damage on it. Pretty brutal for just north of 200 points. In terms of the other chapters, Iron Hands are pretty good for their durability buff on 2 wound units. They'll certainly make the Terminator a lot more survivable, particularly against damage 2 weapons. Raven Guard or Stealthy could be handy for getting them a cover save from guns that are a long way away, which is at its most powerful when it's used on 2-up save models. And Salamanders or Master Artisans certainly won't hurt with a few extra rerolls for those Thunderhammer attacks in close combat. We'll have a quick think about character support now, and out of the generic Space Marine Codex, Captains and Chapter Masters and Lieutenants will certainly up their damage potential, though they might not be the easiest unit to keep in range of an aura, if they're wanting to drop down far from your lines and then make a long charge which might put them out of aura range. Chaplains certainly have amazing synergy with this unit. If you have a jump pack chaplain start on the board, move him up to near where you want your Terminators to drop, and then he can provide that +2 inch to charge aura to maximise their chance of getting them into close combat safely. If you were using him as a Master of Sanctity as well, you might just be able to get him in the aura for reroll hits in close combat, which could be really powerful when combined with those Thunderhammers, because rerolling all of those 1s, 2s and 3s whenever they miss is going to basically equal a 50% damage output buff. So from a min squad that's going to go from 10 wounds on a knight to 15 wounds on a knight on average. Librarians certainly have some powers that they can use to help these guys. I'm not going to go through all of the various powers available to the supplement books, but anything that can either buff the damage output or durability of the units will certainly be a positive. For example, the Salamander's Drake Skin to give them +1 toughness will certainly help them weather the oncoming storm after they've killed whatever target you drop them by. Or, for example, for the Blood Angels, Unleash Rage to give them an extra attack, and you could potentially have 5 attack Thunderhammer Terminators bearing down on your opponent, and there isn't a lot in the game that isn't going to wreck. Let's move on to stratagems now. Honour the chapter to fight again for 3 command points on these Terminators is certainly going to be one of the best returns that you're going to get for this investment. When used on a big fighty unit, getting a whole extra round of close combat could kill an enormous amount of points of enemy models, so it's all around a good thing, and it could also help you consolidate into other enemy units to tie them up, so it's a very powerful option. Fury of the First is another good pick if you do make it into combat with a big unit of Termies. They'll add 1 to their hit roll, which will mean that's basically a 33% buff to the damage output of the Thunderhammer Terminators, or a 25% buff to the damage of the Lightning Claw Terminators. Getting rid of that -1 to hit on the Thunderhammers is a really nasty damage increase, and it could well be worth the 1 command point investment if you absolutely have to make sure a target is dead in this turn. Finally, Transhuman Physiology for 2 command points has quite good synergy with the Terminators. As very heavily armoured but only toughness 4 infantry, it might well be worth your opponent's time firing strength 8 weapons at them. Transhuman Physiology or make it so that these weapons are nowhere near as efficient at killing them. So if you really want to punish your opponent for removing these with heavy weapons, this might be a good shout. Again, there are just so many stratagems out of the supplement books that could potentially work on these guys. Again, as a huge unit, they're going to get good value out of everything that could increase survivability, increase damage output, or particularly anything that could give them a better chance at charging. Finally, these guys do have some transport options as a different way to get them to close combat, other than deep striking. There's always the option of the old way of using a land raider to bust your Terminators up towards the enemy, though it does of course have the disadvantage of putting your land raider at risk of being tied up in close combat and all of its very expensive guns being made useless by a random infantry model being in base to base with it. Personally, I think they're just a little bit too expensive to warrant the points investment. Perhaps if they had some sort of rule to get the Terminators out after it's moved and then charge, you could justify it, but otherwise I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan. So let's talk about some tactics for actually fielding them on the battlefield then. As already discussed, I definitely prefer the Thunderhammer Storm Shield unit to the Lightning Claws, and I could honestly see you using anything from 5 to 10 of these, depending on how many points you had available and how many you wanted to invest in this very heavy punch. As they're a very points intensive unit, a bigger unit will make more efficient use out of buffs and stratagems, but then if they are exposed to enemy fire, you could potentially lose a massive amount of your army in one go. My instincts say I'd probably prefer to field something in the midline, maybe 7 or 8 Thunderhammer Storm Shield Terminators, the sort of points where I could justify investing in buffing characters to get them into close combat, but not invest all the way up to 10, where I have a feeling that you might just overkill whatever you charge at anyway. The way I would personally run them at the moment is, unless I had any other chapter specific buffs to charges, I would combo them with a jump pack chaplain to jump forwards and give them that plus 2 inch to charge rolls. As you're investing a whole ton of points in a very expensive, very damaging melee unit, you absolutely cannot afford to have them just come down, sit and get shot by the entire enemy's army next turn. You absolutely need to make sure they make that charge. Otherwise you've likely wasted quite a big part of your army's points. So as with all deep strike units, you could think about bringing them in turn 2 to influence the game more early, weighed up against the opportunity cost that you might have to bring them down turn 3 when hopefully you've exposed more of your opponent's heavy hitting units to be potential targets of the charge. The other bonus of waiting till turn 3 would be that you might be able to get into Assault Doctrine if you're playing an army that uses it, but again you might have the risk that you'll bring them down too late and the battle might already essentially be decided by that point. When you do drop them down, it's probably worth trying to be in charge range of as many units as possible to give them the maximum amount of options. If you're facing an army with some scary overwatch, you could try and place the unit out of line of sight behind a ruined wall. As they're infantry, they'll be able to charge straight through, and maybe avoid a lot of scary overwatch attacks in the process. If it doesn't compromise your positioning too much, there's certainly nothing wrong with trying to set up in cover. If bad things happen and the charge is failed, at least the enemy army will have to work harder to remove them next turn. When you are fighting with the unit, I'd certainly consider whether or not you're going to use Honour the Chapter. If you do use it to both finish off an enemy unit that you might not quite have killed, or use it to get the extra consolidation to maybe wrap an enemy infantry model and put your Terminators completely surrounding them, you might be able to prevent the enemy from falling back via tri-pointing them, and therefore keep your very nasty assault Terminators safe for another turn. If you do manage to trap an enemy infantry model like this, it could potentially be game changing, so it's certainly worth thinking about when you're looking at drop sites. From there, they're probably likely to be a bit of a reactive unit with only 5 inch movement. They might have limited options for charging, so we'll have to just go for whatever the opponent has left within range. I certainly wouldn't be expecting an assault Terminator squad that you've sent down this way to survive the entire battle, but compared with say Vanguard veterans, it might take the enemy a little bit more effort to grind them down. So in terms of units that are going to deep strike in and do damage to the enemy, they have a few competitors in the Space Marines army. Vanguard veterans, as we've just mentioned, are quite flexible. They can all take storm shields, and you can really tailor them for the ideal foe. Plus their jump packs are quite useful for engaging things like enemy flyers, which the Terminators can't do. So they're another solid melee option that you might consider. Secondly, the regular Terminators with the Stormbolter and Power Fist, or their Tartarus or Cataphractii alternatives, are another very strong competitor, trading out slightly weaker melee and defense for 20 bolter shots at 24-inch range could be a bit of a tricky decision, and depending on what you're trying to achieve, regular Terminators might do you a bit better. And finally, one of the bogeymen of the tournament scene at the moment, the Raven Guard deep striking Assault Centurions, are pretty well superior in every way to Terminators of every stripe. They shoot incredibly hard and have ridiculously strong melee output, while also being a bit tougher due to having 4 wounds, though admittedly they do lack the invul. Unfortunately, while the Raven Guard Assault Centurions can deep strike like this, the Terminator Assault Squad is never going to quite match up to them. But obviously not every Space Marine army is Raven Guard, so if you're playing another chapter, you don't need to compare the Assault Terminators to them at all, because they're not an option for you. Overall, my personal preference in Terminators would be to use the regular version over the Assault Terminators. I like having the flexibility of a bit of extra shooting, and they still have pretty solid melee output as well, while being a little bit cheaper too. Though I do think that they are fairly well balanced with the Assault Terminators, though maybe the Lightning Claw ones could do with going down a little bit in points, as at the moment they just don't really bring as much to the table. As always, thank you for watching another Auspex Tactics review. If you've got any comments on the video, or any strategies for how to use Assault Terminators to the best of their ability, please leave them down below and I'll look forward to reading them. If I've got any rules wrong, please correct me. It's good that we all learn, and feel free to subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. All of this content takes a very long time to make, so if you are enjoying it, any contributions towards the channel's Patreon would certainly be appreciated. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next video.